Grace Thornton had stopped counting the years and started counting coins instead. Somewhere between her 61st birthday and her 64th, the shift happened so gradually that she could not remember the exact morning when she woke up and realized that survival had replaced living. The small house in the outskirts of Detroit still stood the way Robert had left it, with the gutters slightly crooked on the east side and the porch light flickering every time the wind picked up. But the man who used to climb a ladder every spring to fix those gutters was 3 years underground now, and the light kept flickering because Grace could not afford an electrician and could not risk the ladder herself. Her mornings began at 5:30, not by choice, but because her body had learned the rhythm of worry, and worry does not believe in sleeping in. The city outside her window was still half asleep, under the pale yellow wash of streetlights that had not yet surrendered to the sun. She filled the kettle from the tap, listening to the water hit the old metal bottom, with a sound like small stones dropping into a tin pail. The coffee filter was aluminum chipped at one corner, where Robert had once dropped it reaching for the sugar jar on a Sunday morning years ago. She had never replaced it, not because she was sentimental in any conscious way, but because replacing things costs money. And money had become the language she spoke most fluently, every syllable a subtraction. She stood leaning against the sink, both hands wrapped around the mug, and looked out through the small window above the faucet. The glass was fogged with steam. Beyond it, the neighbor's fence leaned at an angle that worsened each winter, but never quite fell. The street was empty. A single crow sat on the power line motionless, as if it too was waiting for something that might not come. She could not remember the last time she had bought something simply because she liked it. Every purchase now was a negotiation between need and dread usually won. The refrigerator door behind her was covered with paper. Not photographs, not magnets shaped like fruit or states she had visited. Bills, utility bills, hospital bills. A notice from the insurance company printed on paper so thin it felt like it might dissolve in her hands. She had arranged them in order of urgency, the most overdue at eye level, the ones that could wait another week near the bottom. Robert's final hospitalization had cost more than the house was worth. She had sold his truck, cashed in a small life insurance policy that turned out to be smaller than either of them had imagined. And still the numbers kept arriving like weather that could not be avoided, only endured. Her shift at the hospital gift counter began at 7. The work was light but monotonous in the way that only work done among illness can be. She sold get well soon cards with flowers on the front and blank insides that people filled with words they hoped would matter. She sold fake bouquets wrapped in cellophane stuffed bears holding satin hearts. She smiled at the customers and wrapped their purchases carefully. People came there because of illness, not to make friends. She understood that weight. She had carried it herself, walking these same corridors when Robert was in the oncology ward, watching the fluorescent lights buzz overhead, and thinking that hospitals must be the loneliest places on earth. Not because people are alone in them, but because they are surrounded by others who are equally alone. The afternoon she came home and found the envelope, the light had already shifted to that late amber tone that Detroit gets in early autumn. The mailbox at the curb was the old-fashioned kind, black metal with a red flag that no longer stayed up. She pulled out the usual handful, a credit card offer. She would shred a flyer for a church rummage sale, a reminder from the dentist she could not afford to visit, and then beneath all of it, a thick envelope that made her stop. It did not look like a bill. The paper was stiff and white, the kind of heavy stock that law offices use when they want you to know the contents matter. Her name was printed clearly in the center, not scribbled by hand the way debt collection letters always were. There was a return address in the upper left corner, a firm in Chicago. She did not recognize the name. She carried everything inside. Set her handbag on the kitchen table the way she always did, and only then sat down and carefully tore open the edge of the envelope. The letter was from the law offices of Callaway Brandt and Pierce, Chicago, Illinois. It informed her in language that was precise without being warm that Dorothy Callaway had passed away on the 14th of last month at the age of 87. That Miss Callaway had left a will. that Grace Thornton, née Wyatt, had been named as the sole heir. The name made her sit down harder in the chair, as if the air had been pressed out of the room. Dorothy Calloway. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in decades. In the family mythology, Dorothy was a figure drawn in simple and flattering lines. The older sister who had stayed behind, who had chosen a house over her family, who had cut herself off from everyone and lived alone in a place no one visited. Grace's mother, Ruth, had spoken of her only rarely, and always with the tight-lipped brevity of someone swallowing something bitter. Grace remembered the particular way Ruth's jaw would set whenever Dorothy's name surfaced, the way her eyes would go flat and distant, as if she were looking at a door she had closed a long time ago and refused to reopen. She made her choice, Ruth would say. Best to leave her to it. And the subject would close like a book being shut. And Grace learned early that some questions were not meant to be asked twice. She had never met Dorothy, had never visited the property, had never even seen a photograph of it. She knew only that the family had once had a guest house somewhere in upstate New York, a place that belonged to a time before everyone scattered in different directions, like leaves torn from the same branch by a wind no one could name. The inheritance was the guest house on several acres of land in a small town whose name she did not recognize. Attached to it was an overdue tax payment that had to be resolved within 30 days, or the property would be seized by the county. The letter included a key taped to a separate card inside the envelope, a small brass key with a tarnished surface and no label. She let the letter fall onto the table. The kitchen was quieter than usual, or perhaps she was simply listening harder. The wall clock ticked with the steady, indifferent rhythm of something that did not care what news had just arrived. Her first thought was not hope. It was calculation. If there was still old furniture inside a few porcelain pieces, antique fixtures, they might be sold. If the land still had value, it might be negotiated with a developer or the county. If the total was enough to pay off the bills on the refrigerator door, she might be able to keep this house, the one Robert had painted every 5 years, the one where her daughter Claire had taken her first steps on the kitchen linoleum, the one where the ghosts of Sunday chicken soup still lingered in the walls if she stood still long enough to listen. That night, Grace did not turn on the television. She sat at the kitchen table under the overhead light that Robert had installed the year they moved, in the one with the slightly crooked shade she had never straightened. And she read the letter 2 more times. Then she took out a small spiral notebook from the junk drawer and began writing things down. Gas expenses for the drive. How many days she could take off work without losing her position. Food money on the road. Everything had to be calculated because in Grace's life, the margin between getting by and going under was exactly the width of a single unexpected expense. 3 days later, she stuffed a few sets of clothes into an old suitcase with a broken wheel, locked the front door, checked it twice, and got into the car. The sedan was a 12-year-old model that rattled every time it hit a pothole and made a sound from somewhere under the hood that she had learned to ignore because the mechanic had quoted her $600 to fix it, and $600 might as well have been $6,000. But the engine turned over every morning, and the tires were not bald yet, and that was enough. The road from Detroit to upstate New York was longer than she had imagined. Or perhaps it only felt that way because she was driving towards something she could not picture. The interstate stretched ahead of her, gray and monotonous, lined with the same gas stations, the same fast food signs rising on poles above the tree line, the same rest stops with vending machines that charged too much for water. She passed through small towns whose names she forgot as soon as she left them. She did not stop anywhere for long. Every stop was an expense. She ate a sandwich she had made at home, wrapped in foil, sitting in the car at a rest area where a family with 3 children was having a picnic at the concrete table. And she watched them for a moment with the particular attention of someone who remembers what it was like to be part of a group that size. When she turned onto the road leading to the address written in the letter, the sun had already tilted toward the west. The light changed. It went from the flat glare of the highway to something softer, something golden that poured through the tall rows of trees lining both sides of the narrow dirt road. The shadows stretched long across the ground, reaching toward the car like fingers. The air coming through her cracked window smelled different here. Something green and damp and old. The smell of earth that has been doing its work for a very long time without anyone watching. The house appeared after a bend in the road, as if it had been waiting for her to turn the corner before it would show itself. It was bigger than she had imagined, but not in a way that overwhelmed. Rather in a way that made her understand it had once been very beautiful. The wooden front porch leaned slightly to the left, its planks darkened by decades of weather and the particular kind of neglect that comes not from carelessness, but from a single pair of hands that could no longer keep up. The windows were shut tight, the curtains behind them faded to the color of old cream. The front garden had gone wild with weeds, but the original stone path leading up to the steps could still be traced beneath the overgrowth like a sentence half buried under years of silence. Grace turned off the engine and sat still. The silence was immediate and complete in a way that city silence never is. No traffic, no distant sirens, only the light wind moving through the treetops, a sound so gentle it was almost a thought rather than a noise. She opened the car door and stepped out. Her shoes crunched against the gravel. The smell of old wood and damp earth wrapped around her like a shawl she had not asked to wear. She stood there looking at the house the way someone looks at a face they are trying to recognize. She had never been here, and yet something about the proportions stirred a feeling she could not name, as if her body remembered something her mind did not. The key turned with more resistance than a new lock would give, but it turned. The door opened with a long, slow creak that seemed to come from deep inside the wood itself, as if the house were exhaling after holding its breath for years. The space inside was darker than outside. The air was cool but not cold, carrying the particular smell of a place that has been unoccupied for a long time, but not entirely forgotten dust and dry wood, and something faintly floral, like the ghost of a perfume someone wore decades ago. She stepped in. The wooden floor creaked softly under her feet with each step. A long table stood in the middle of the living room, its surface dulled by dust but its legs still sturdy. A few wooden chairs were arranged neatly around it, pushed in as if the last person to sit there had taken the time to straighten them before leaving. A few framed photographs hung on the wall, their glass clouded but not cracked. She moved closer to one of the frames and gently wiped the dust away with her sleeve. The photograph showed a family standing in front of this house on a sunny day. 5 people, 2 women, a man, 2 children. The faces had blurred with time, but they were still clear enough to tell that these people had once stood very close together, not because the photographer asked them to, but because that was how they were. She moved deeper into the house, one room at a time. The kitchen at the back, its counters made of worn butcher block. Its cabinets painted white with the paint peeling at the lower edges. The dining room with a tablecloth folded over the back of a chair. The narrow staircase leading upstairs, its banister, rubbed smooth by thousands of hands over the decades. Everything was old, but nothing was messy. The house had the feeling of a place whose owner had left very slowly, very deliberately, putting each thing in its proper place before walking out for the last time. On the first night, Grace did not clean much. She wiped down a long couch in the living room, opened 2 windows to let the air circulate, and spread out the thin blanket she had brought from Detroit. She lay down and looked up at the ceiling where the wood grain ran in long parallel lines the length of the room. The wind outside touched the window gently, repeatedly, like someone knocking who was too polite to insist. She closed her eyes. The next morning, Grace woke because sunlight was shining through the thin, faded curtains. The light stretched across the wooden floor in long rectangles, illuminating old scratches and the slow drift of dust particles floating in the air. She sat up slowly, her knees aching from a night on a couch too short for her body. From outside came the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, the kind of layered, unhurried sound that in Detroit she rarely heard in full. She went into the kitchen and turned on the faucet. The pipes groaned, then coughed, then released a thin stream of water that was slightly brown before running clear. cool and clean. That was the first good sign. She set the kettle on the stove and searched in her bag for the packet of instant coffee and the travel mug with the paint worn off on the outside, the one Robert had given her from a hospital fundraiser. While waiting for the water to boil, she began to examine the kitchen more carefully. The wooden wall cabinets were still sturdy, their hinges blackened with age but holding firm. A row of small brass hooks was attached beneath the lowest shelf, each one shaped like a curled leaf. Tablecloths were folded neatly in a drawer with the precision of someone who believed that even linen deserved respect. A set of blue-rimmed porcelain dishes was stacked in the upper cabinet, the glaze still holding its color. She opened a low cabinet near the back door, the kind built into the wall at knee height, with a small brass latch. Inside were cloth-covered notebooks, 3 of them tied with string. The first was a record of seasonal menus written in a hand that was small, round, and remarkably even. Apple pie in September, onion soup in winter, mint lemon tea for hot days, blueberry cobbler. When the berries came in from the garden, never from the store. The second notebook was a reservation book. Guest names, arrival dates, departure dates, special notes in the margins. Room 3 needs an extra blanket. Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker like strawberry jam with breakfast. The Lewis child is allergic to pecans. Mrs. Davenport takes her tea without milk but will not ask for it unless you offer. The Petersons' anniversary is June 12th. Put wildflowers on the nightstand. Grace turned the pages slowly, her finger pausing on notes that were brief but attentive to the point of seeming almost intimate. These were not the records of a businesswoman tracking transactions. They were the observations of someone who paid attention to people the way most people pay attention to weather, constantly, instinctively, without being asked. Then, between 2 entries about a guest from Albany, Grace found a line that stopped her hand. The ink was slightly different, darker, as if the pen had been pressed harder. Call Ruth in Detroit. If she does not answer, call again on Thursday night. Ruth, her mother's name. In the family's telling, Dorothy had cut all contact decades ago, had never called, had never written, had chosen her house and her solitude over her younger sister and everyone connected to her. But here was Ruth's name written on the same line as a note about ordering Earl Grey tea and checking the pipes before the first frost, as if calling her sister was one more task in the daily rhythm of keeping a house alive. Not dramatic, not anguished, just there. Near noon, Grace opened all the first-floor windows. Fresh air poured into the house from every direction, carrying the smell of grass warming in the sun and the slight sharpness of damp earth drying. She found a broom in the laundry room, along with cleaning cloths and a bucket with a crack along one side that held water if she did not fill it past the halfway mark. She worked room by room, sweeping dust from window ledges, clearing cobwebs from the staircase corners, scrubbing a light spread of mold from the dining room window frame. Every small task made the house feel less unfamiliar, as if by touching its surfaces she was introducing herself, and the house was beginning to accept her presence. In the afternoon, there was the sound of a car stopping outside. Not the quiet arrival of a sedan, but the heavier sound of a truck, its engine idling before cutting off. A dark blue pickup was parked under the shade of the largest maple in the front yard, a tree whose trunk was wide enough that 2 people could not have reached around it holding hands. The woman who stepped out looked to be in her late 30s, with brown hair tied in a high bun, already coming loose on one side, wearing jeans and a wide-sleeved linen shirt. She was holding a tray covered with a cloth, and she walked toward the porch with the easy stride of someone who had walked this path many times before. "You must be Grace Thornton." Her voice was gentle and clear. "I'm June Holloway. I live in the house at the end of the road. Word gets around in a place this size. I heard someone had come to take over the guest house, so I brought blueberry muffins." Grace looked at the tray, then at the woman, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, the particular warmth of being noticed by a stranger who expected nothing in return. "Thank you, you didn't have to. People here still do that." June smiled and held out the tray, and Grace noticed the woman's hands were strong. The nails short and clean, the hands of someone who worked with earth or wood or both. At least they used to. Grace took the tray and leaned aside to let June step onto the porch. June's eyes moved across the front of the house the way someone scans a face they have not seen in years. I used to come here a lot when I was little. June's voice softened. My mother sometimes helped Miss Dorothy in the winter. Cleaning rooms, changing bedsheets, little odd jobs. I used to sit on those steps right there eating cookies and listening to the guests talk through the open windows. She paused, and her expression shifted to something more private, more careful. After my father left, Miss Dorothy gave my mother extra work through the slow months, never called it charity, never made it feel like a favor, just said she needed help with the linens and the garden, and could my mother spare the time. My mother knew, but she also knew that Dorothy understood the difference between needing help and being made to feel helpless, and that difference mattered more than pride. Grace set the tray on the porch railing. You knew her, Dorothy. June shrugged the way someone shrugs when the truth is more complicated than any answer can hold. In the way a child knows an adult who lives alone. She was not friendly, not in the way most people mean. She did not invite you in or ask about your day, but she was never rude. She used to lend me books, old ones with cloth covers and gold lettering. One time, she mended my coat, the blue one with the broken zipper, and hung it on the hook by the back door without saying a word. I only found out because my mother noticed the stitching. Grace was silent for a moment. In my family, no one told it that way. Not everyone here liked her either. June leaned against the porch post. Miss Dorothy did not say much, kept her distance. But she remembered everything. People's birthdays, the food they liked, who needed what but was too proud to ask. She'd leave things on doorsteps, a jar of soup when someone was sick, a bag of apples in the fall, never signed her name. June glanced towards the front door. Have you seen the breakfast room in the back yet? No. The door sticks. You have to lift the handle a little before it opens. Old trick. My mother taught me. After June left, Grace walked through the small hallway behind the kitchen. At the end was a white painted door, the paint peeling at the lower edge. She did as instructed, lifting the handle and pushing inward. The room behind it was narrow and flooded with afternoon light from 3 window frames looking out over the back garden. A round table stood in the center, covered with a lace cloth that had yellowed at the edges but still held its pattern. 4 wicker chairs surrounded it. A small glass cabinet stood against the far wall with empty jam jars arranged in a row, their labels handwritten. Raspberry, peach, fig. On the windowsill was a tin box with a faded floral pattern. Inside were Polaroid photographs with the colors shifting toward blue, a few Christmas cards, and scraps of paper folded into small squares. One read in the same careful handwriting as the notebooks, "Remember to call Detroit on Thursday." Another shorter, "Send money for the fall semester. Do not put a name." Grace placed the papers on the table and read them again. Dorothy Calloway. The woman who had supposedly abandoned her family had been sending money, anonymously. The handwriting was steady and practiced. The notes written with the same matter-of-fact precision as the menu lists and guest records, as if sending money to a family that believed she did not care about them was just another chore between ordering tea and checking the pipes. Her phone vibrated. Claire's name appeared on the screen. "You're really there." Her daughter's voice came through without a greeting. The way Claire always started calls when she was worried and did not want to admit it. "Yes." "How long are you planning to stay?" "I don't know yet. The lawyer called me this morning. She said the house owes taxes and a decision has to be made quickly. Don't let this drag on. If someone wants to buy it, sell it." Grace looked at the scraps of paper on the table. "I only got here yesterday." "That's exactly why you shouldn't get attached to it. It's just an old house, Mom. You went there to solve a problem, not to live inside someone else's memories." "I'll call you back later." Don't turn something simple into something complicated. The call ended. Grace placed the phone face down on the table. She gathered the scraps of paper, put them back into the tin box, then walked out the back door toward the narrow brick path she had seen from the window. The bricks were no longer intact. Many had sunk into the ground or tilted where grass roots had pushed into the cracks. Wild daisies grew over the edges. At the end of the path, half hidden behind overgrown boxwood, was a small greenhouse. Its white-painted iron frame had peeled almost entirely, patches of rust showing through like a map of neglected years. Several cracked panes had been patched with yellowed plastic sheeting. The narrow door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Inside, the air was warmer and drier, trapped heat smelling of old soil and dried leaves. Wooden shelves lined both walls, most pots empty now. A small work table stood against the back wall, its surface scarred with knife marks and water stains. On the table was a tin watering can with a dented spout, old seed packets, and a thin notebook wrapped in brown leather. Grace opened it, expecting an expense book or planting schedule. Instead, she found a list of guest house tasks interwoven with sentences that did not belong to any ledger. Change the bed linens in room 2, buy more Earl Grey tea, send pastries to the Holloway house when the little girl recovers from her fever. Call Ruth in Detroit. If she does not answer, call again on Thursday night. She turned the page. Send money to repair the fireplace before winter. Do not sign the name. That blue coat of little Claire's probably does not fit anymore by now. Ask June whether there is still anyone in town who does knitting. Do not call if she's still angry. Wait until next month. Another page. Claire drew a house today. Ruth sent the picture without a note. The girl draws houses a great deal. I hope she always has a place to draw. Dorothy had known about Claire's drawings, had known about the blue coat, had known about the fireplace that needed fixing, had been sending money, asking questions through whatever indirect channels the family's silence had left open, keeping track of lives she had been told she was not part of, and doing it all without a single person knowing. Grace closed the notebook and carried it out of the greenhouse, holding it against her chest. The afternoon light had turned honey-colored over the grass that reached her knees. She went in through the back door and walked straight upstairs. The second floor had a long hallway with a window at the far end letting in fading light. All doors were closed. She opened them one by one. Some rooms held only an iron bed frame and an empty wardrobe. Some still had pale floral curtains, bedspreads, folded flat nightstands with empty water glasses, as if waiting for guests who might walk in at any moment. The last room was larger than the others. Grace knew immediately this was Dorothy's room, not because there was a nameplate, but because the room had the particular density of a space someone had lived in for a very long time. On the bed was a cream-colored blanket, worn thin at the edges where hands had pulled it up night after night for decades. On the bedside table sat reading glasses with silver frames. A small wind-up clock stopped at 3:20, and a hardcover novel placed face down, its spine cracked. The wardrobe stood slightly open. Inside hung 2 wool dresses, a gray coat with bone buttons and a wide-brimmed hat tied with a ribbon that had once been burgundy. The clothes smelled of cedar and the faintest trace of lavender. And Grace understood that Dorothy had not owned many things, but had taken care of the things she owned. She pulled open the dressing table drawer. Inside were a comb with a tortoiseshell-handled handkerchiefs folded into precise squares and a stack of envelopes tied with a silver ribbon. On the first envelope was a name written in the familiar, careful hand. Not Grace Thornton, not her married name. Gracie. No one had called her that in decades. Her mother had called her that when she was very small, before the name got swallowed by the formalities of growing up. But here it was written by a woman she had never met, in handwriting that somehow felt more familiar than a stranger's shod. She sat down on the edge of the bed and untied the ribbon. The first letter was dated more than 10 years earlier, the pen strokes even and firm. Dear Gracie, I am writing this letter without knowing whether I will send it. Perhaps I should have spoken much earlier when you were younger and I was less proud. Pride is a strange thing. It feels like strength until you realize it has been a wall all along, and by the time you notice, the wall is too high to see over and too thick to shout through. Your mother hates this house because she thinks it stole my youth. Perhaps she also hates me because I did not live with her when I still could. But there are places that keep people from leaving, not because of duty, but because they are the only place where they know they once belonged. Grace read each line slowly, the way someone drinks water after a long thirst. There was no grand defense, no attempt to rewrite history. Only a voice less guarded than she had imagined, almost clumsy in certain places, especially when it mentioned family, as if the pen had stumbled over emotions the hand was not practiced at expressing. At the bottom of the page, the handwriting grew slightly smaller, as if the writer were running out of either space or courage. I still hear news of you through the foolish roundabout ways our family has always used instead of sitting down and talking. I know you became a nurse. I know you married a man a few years younger than you. I know your daughter liked to draw when she was little. I know those things, and still I could not walk through the door of my own making. Some people leave doors open and forget to walk through them, and by the time they remember, the hallway is too long and their legs are too tired. That is my fault. I own it the way I own this house completely, and with no one else to blame. Grace placed the letter on her lap. The room had grown darker while she was reading. The last light clung to the edge of the window glass like something unwilling to let go. She felt something shift inside her chest, not dramatically, not like a door slamming open, but like a lock clicking, the kind of small, precise sound that changes everything that comes after it. She picked up more letters. Some were short, barely half a page. Some had been started and stopped halfway through. Some contained only two questions written in the center of the page, like a poem composed by someone who did not know she was writing one. Does your back still ache when the weather turns cold? And does Claire still like apple pie? The light was nearly gone. Grace tied the ribbon around the letters again, carefully matching the knot to the impression it had left in the paper. She slid them into her coat pocket. Then she sat in the darkening room in the chair of a woman she had never known in a house she had come to sell. And she listened to the wind outside. And she thought about all the letters people write and never send, and all the doors people build and never open, and how sometimes the distance between love and silence is not as far as everyone pretends. The sound of tires on gravel reached her the next morning, before she saw the car. Grace was in the kitchen rinsing the travel mug when the particular crunch of a vehicle moving slowly up the drive cut through the quiet. This was something smooth and deliberate, the sound of a car that had been waxed recently and driven carefully. She walked to the front door. A black sedan was parked in front of the porch. The man who stepped out was wearing a beige sport coat over a white shirt, dark trousers with a crease that could have cut paper, and shoes that looked wrong against the gravel, too clean, too seedy. His hair was combed flat with the kind of precision that suggested a mirror had been consulted more than once. The smile was already on his face before he straightened up, before he even looked at the house, as if it was something he put on along with the jacket. He carried a small bouquet of carnations in one hand and a thin envelope in the other. He walked up the porch steps without hesitation and stopped at the threshold, waiting for permission. "Mrs. Thornton!" His voice was warm in the practiced way that warmth becomes when it is a professional tool. "I'm sorry for arriving without notice. I'm Warren Keyes. I believe it's time for us to have a serious conversation about this house." Grace did not take the flowers. She leaned to one side and Warren crossed the threshold with careful movements, the gestures of someone who wanted to show he understood boundaries while fully intending to redraw them. He placed the carnations on the small table by the door. In the living room, he sat on the edge of the sofa, back straight, knees together, and looked around with a single quick sweep that took in the condition of the wall, ceiling, floor, and dust. His eyes moved the way a calculator works, fast and without sentiment. "I know the timing is delicate, but there are matters that need to be dealt with soon. Property tax, liability insurance, regional zoning records. I've been keeping an eye on this place for years. Beautiful location, mature trees. The frame is in better condition than most people would guess. If renovated properly, it could become a very attractive weekend retreat." Grace remained standing. She did not sit down across from him, did not pour tea, did not play the host. "You want to tear it down?" That depends on the final plan. Warren shrugged, the motion small and calculated. The exterior could be preserved, the interior modernized. Part of the back kitchen could be removed to open up the sight line. The breakfast room has tremendous potential for floor-to-ceiling windows. As for the wood-paneled cabinets by the north hallway, they would almost certainly need to come out entirely. The moisture damage in spaces like that is usually extensive. Grace's eyes narrowed. The north hallway was tucked behind the staircase, a section she had only glanced into. It was not visible from the front rooms, not the kind of feature anyone would mention in a casual survey of a property they claim to know only from outside. The north hallway is almost completely hidden. I've only opened a few rooms myself. What kind of inspector remembers wood-paneled cabinets in a section most people would walk past without noticing? Warren's expression did not change. The smile held. When you've worked in this area for a long time, you hear more than you'd expect. People talk. Inspectors file reports. Details accumulate. The answer was smooth, but smoothness is not the same as truth. And Grace had spent enough years reading the faces of people who did not want to be read to know the difference. She filed the discrepancy away the way she filed unpaid bills carefully, and in order knowing she would return to it. Warren pushed the envelope across the table. This is a formal offer. I'm willing to purchase the entire property, including the back garden, the greenhouse, and the outbuildings. The price is enough for you to settle everything outstanding with a comfortable amount left over. You seem to know my financial situation quite well. Public records, Mrs. Thornton. Property liens. Hospital billing disputes. I'm not prying. I am simply trying to show you that I understand your position. Grace looked at the envelope. She did not pick it up. I'll think about it. I hope you won't think too long. The county is not patient, and neither is the town. At the door, Grace asked the question that had been forming since he mentioned the north hallway. Did you know Dorothy? Warren paused, one hand on the door frame. Only in passing. She was not the kind of person who invited people in. Did you like her? That isn't particularly relevant. To me it is. Warren turned back and looked at Grace for a moment longer than was comfortable. I respect people who know how to hold on to property longer than most. But in the end, houses are only houses, Mrs. Thornton. They don't love you back. The sedan backed down the drive and disappeared beyond the tree line. Grace carried the envelope into the kitchen and set it beside the box of muffins. She made tea instead of coffee. She sat down and opened the offer. The number was large enough to make her hands still. It would clear the hospital debt. It would repair the roof in Detroit. It would replace the car. It would buy her 3, maybe 4 years of not counting every coin before she spent it. She folded the paper neatly and placed the envelope on the table the way someone places a loaded weapon in a drawer, carefully and with full awareness of what it could do. Her phone vibrated. A message from Claire. Have you met Warren Keyes yet? He contacted me this morning. If the price is decent, sign it. You cannot stay there forever. He had contacted Claire directly, before coming to the house, before presenting the offer. He had gone to her daughter first, recruited an ally, and then arrived at the front door with flowers and a number, knowing the ground had already been prepared. Grace typed a few words and deleted them, typed again, finally sent only 4. I haven't decided yet. Claire's reply arrived instantly. Haven't decided what? You went there to solve a problem, not to live inside someone else's memories. Grace placed the phone face down. She finished half a muffin, then walked outside. The evening air had cooled. She walked around the side of the house to the north wall. From outside it looked ordinary clapboard siding, weathered to a uniform gray. But near the far end, a section was slightly darker. The boards newer by a few years, as if replaced at a different time. She went back inside and took a measuring tape from the laundry room tool bag. She measured from the staircase door to the corner of the room, then walked into the hallway and measured again. The numbers did not match. The difference was not dramatic, perhaps 2 feet, but it was there, consistent and deliberate. Near the end of the hallway, beneath a faded landscape painting of a lake at sunset, there was a low wall cabinet she had not noticed before. She opened the bottom drawer. Between old tablecloths and half-used candles was a small brass key tied with a tarnished silver string. Attached to the string was a stiff paper tag, and on it in Dorothy's unmistakable handwriting, "Family room, open only when you are ready to stay longer than a weekend." Grace carried the key upstairs to Dorothy's bedroom. She took the stack of letters from her coat pocket and continued reading. One envelope had no date and no name. Inside was a single sheet with a single sentence centered in the middle. "If Gracie finds the key, then the girl has gone farther than anything I imagined." Grace stood up. She carried the key downstairs, walked the north hallway, and stopped in front of the paneling that did not match. Running her fingers along the surface, she found a raised molding near the floor so small that without searching she would have passed it 100 times. Beneath it was a keyhole. She inserted the key and turned. Inside the wall, something clicked dry and precise. She placed both hands on the edge and pushed. Years of humidity had sealed it tight. She braced her shoulder and pushed harder. Dust fell in soft cascades from the narrow gap, and the air that escaped smelled of dry timber and old fabric, and the particular stillness of a room that has not been entered in a very long time. The panel slid to the left, revealing an opening just wide enough for one person. Grace reached inside, found the switch. A pale yellow light came on from a frosted ceiling lamp, soft and low, just enough to illuminate everything clearly. The room was small, almost square, with no windows. It held an armchair upholstered in faded green velvet, a couch covered with a wool blanket, a round tea table with turned legs, and two low bookshelves against the far wall. In the corner stood a small upright piano, and on top of it a picture frame, a mantel clock with stopped hands, and a porcelain bowl filled with buttons of every color. On the couch was a patchwork quilt, worn at the edges but clean, each square a different pattern stitched together, with the patience of someone who understood that the beauty of broken things lies in how they are joined. Beneath the tea table was a large wooden box with a brass clasp. On the walls, family photographs were attached with small clips to ribbons, stretched horizontally, dozens of them, arranged by some private logic. Only the person who hung them would understand. This was not a hiding place for valuables. Nothing here would sell for much at auction. This was a room built to preserve the things that have no price, but cost everything to lose. The first photograph on the left showed two young women standing by a lake, their hair lifted by wind. The shorter one was Ruth. Grace recognized her mother instantly. The bridge of the nose, the way she stood with her weight on one hip, the smile wider and less guarded than any smile Grace had ever seen her wear. The taller one was Dorothy when she was young, her face turned halfway aside, her mouth curved in a smile that seemed surprised by its own existence. They were standing close together, shoulders touching, and there was nothing in the image that suggested these two women would ever become strangers. Grace opened the wooden box. Inside, arranged with meticulous care, were envelopes. Thin photo albums, photocopied birth certificates, postcards, money transfer receipts bundled with rubber bands, birthday cards and children's drawings done in crayon with faded colors. One separate stack of envelopes was tied with a blue ribbon. The tag read, "For the years that were lost." She untied the ribbon. The first letter was addressed to Ruth, but bore no postmark. Dorothy had written that she intended to invite her younger sister back in the summer, that she would give them the room overlooking the apple garden, that she would bake pie and make iced tea the way they used to as children. Then the handwriting shifted, the letters pressing deeper, the ink thickening. "But you will not come if I write as though nothing happened. I know that. And I cannot write about what happened, because I do not have words for it that would not make it worse." The second item was a bank receipt from more than 30 years ago, money transferred to a fireplace repair company in Detroit. Attached was a note, "Winter in Michigan does not spare a person raising a small child." The third was a tuition bill from a children's art studio, and in the upper corner in Dorothy's handwriting was Claire's name. On the back, the girl draws houses a great deal. I hope she always has a place to draw. Grace held the paper and understood what she had never known. Claire had taken a short drawing class at 6. She remembered how Claire came home with paint on her fingers and joy in her face. Then the class stopped because there was no money. An anonymous payment had arrived at exactly the right moment. Grace and Robert had assumed it came from the church benevolence fund. They had never questioned it. Beneath the receipts, she found a thin folder held with a butterfly clip. Inside were photocopied pages of a contract dated 15 years earlier between Dorothy Calloway and Warren Keyes, a deposit agreement for the northern parcel. The terms were specific residential use, only tree-line preserved access road kept open. But attached was a letter from Dorothy's attorney terminating the agreement. Warren had filed a revised development plan with the county that violated every condition, replacing residential use with a commercial resort that would require clearing the north trees and redirecting the road. Behind the letter was a handwritten note in Dorothy's script, smaller than usual, the letters pressed tight. Warren Keyes entered the house while I was at the doctor's appointment in the city. June saw his car parked outside the gate for 2 hours. That is why I changed every lock and sealed the north hallway. A man who walks into your house uninvited will take more than the floorboards if you let him. Grace read the note twice. Now she understood why Warren knew about the wood panel cabinets. Not because of inspection reports. Not because people told him. Because he had walked through this house while its owner was away, taking measurements, taking notes, taking the kind of inventory a man takes when he has already decided a place belongs to him and is only waiting for the formality of ownership to catch up. She picked up her phone and called June Holloway. When Grace asked about Warren and the car outside the gate 15 years ago, June's voice went quiet. Yes, I was maybe 22, 23. I saw his car there on a Tuesday afternoon, which was always when Miss Dorothy went to her appointments. She had a routine. Everyone knew it. He parked under the big maple and went inside through the side door. I told my mother, and my mother told Miss Dorothy. June paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the particular weight of a person who had kept a confidence for 15 years and was only now setting it down. After that, she changed all the locks, had a man from Kingston install new deadbolts. She never said his name again, but she kept every piece of paper. Miss Dorothy was not the kind of woman who forgot. She was the kind who filed things in order and waited for the right person to find them. Grace thanked her and ended the call. She sat in the hidden room surrounded by the paper trail of a life lived in parallel to her own, close enough to touch, but never touching. And she felt the shape of the story changing, the simple fable of the cold aunt, dissolving into something far more complicated. A woman who had loved from behind a wall she could not bring herself to tear down, and a man who had walked through that wall without permission and was now standing at the door again, smiling, holding flowers. The sound of a car arriving faster than Warren's sedan, sharper, reached her from the front of the house. Grace stood, quickly placed the folder on the tea table, stepped through the panel opening, and pulled it nearly shut behind her. She walked into the center of the house just as the front door opened. Claire was standing in the living room, handbag still over her shoulder, face carrying the tension of someone who has driven a long distance fueled by worry and frustration in equal measure. Behind her, half hidden by her legs, stood Theo, taller than the last time Grace had seen him. Black hair falling across his forehead, holding a comic book, and looking around with the wide, unguarded curiosity that only children bring to unfamiliar places. "You didn't say you were coming." Grace's voice was steady, but her pulse was not. "I wasn't sure I should." Claire looked around the room. "But you texted, 'I haven't decided yet,' and then went completely silent. I had to drive out here myself to see what exactly is happening." Theo edged closer to his grandmother. "Grandma, this house is really big." His voice was soft with wonder. the voice of a boy who had grown up in apartments and measured space in rooms, not acres. Grace placed a hand on the boy's shoulder for a moment, feeling the small bones beneath his jacket. "Are you tired from the drive?" "No, Mum bought me French fries at the rest stop." Claire set her bag down with more force than necessary. "Mum, don't change the subject." "I'm not changing it. The two of you just arrived." "Exactly. And you are staying in a falling apart house that belongs to someone who almost never cared about our family, while there's a fair purchase offer in front of you that could fix everything." Claire folded her arms, and Grace saw in that gesture the same protective stubbornness Robert used to show when he was afraid but did not want to admit it. "You don't know the whole story, Claire. Then tell me. Tell me why you're thinking about keeping a place you never lived in, never mentioned, never visited, instead of selling it and settling the bills that have been burying you for 3 years. Grace did not answer with words. She walked to the end of the hallway, placed her hand on the wooden panel, and pushed it open. The pale yellow light from the hidden room spilled into the corridor. "There's something in here that you should see before you tell me to sign anything." Claire did not step through right away. She stood at the edge, one hand on the doorframe, looking in the way someone looks into water before deciding whether it is shallow enough to wade or deep enough to drown. Theo had no such hesitation. He slipped past his mother and through the opening with the easy courage of a boy who had not yet learned to be afraid of rooms he did not understand. He moved straight to the photographs on the wall, his face tilted upward, eyes scanning the images with focused attention. Claire followed slowly. Her eyes moved from the armchair to the couch to the piano to the wooden box lying open on the tea table. She stopped in the center and stood very still, and Grace could see the calculations happening behind her daughter's eyes, the rapid sorting of what is valuable and what is not, followed by the slower, harder realization that value is not always a number. "How long have you been in here?" "Long enough to know that many things in this house are not what we were told." Grace picked up the stack of letters tied with the blue ribbon and held them out. Claire took them with both hands and a slight hesitation before opening. She pulled out the first letter, unfolded it, and began reading. Grace watched the tension in her jaw shift from resistance to attention to something that did not have a name yet. Theo had drifted to the far wall where crayon drawings were clipped to ribbons alongside the photographs. He pointed at one, a sheet of construction paper faded from bright yellow to the color of weak sunlight. "This looks like the kind of thing I used to draw in first grade." His finger traced the outline of a house with a triangle roof, smoke curling from a chimney, 3 figures standing by the front door with extended arms and circle faces. Claire glanced over at what Theo was pointing at, and then she froze. Grace saw it happen, the exact moment her body went rigid, the breath catching somewhere between lungs and throat. In the lower corner, barely visible after decades of fading, were the uneven letters of a child who had just learned to write Claire. And beside it, in Dorothy's careful script, a date and 3 words kept for always. The drawing was Claire's, made when she was 5 or 6, sent through channels Grace had never known existed, and preserved here in this windowless room behind a wall, with the same care Dorothy brought to everything she touched. Claire pulled a chair from the tea table and sat down without looking away from the drawing. She opened the second letter. The room grew quiet in a way that was not empty, but full, the kind of quiet that accumulates when people are reading words that were meant for them, but arrived decades too late. Grace arranged the receipts and notes into small piles on the table. One pile for things sent to Detroit, one for unsent letters to Ruth, one for notes about Claire as a child. Theo moved from photograph to photograph along the wall with solemn attentiveness. When Claire finished the second letter, she looked up. Her face had lost its color, gone pale beneath the overhead light, eyes wet. Though no tears had fallen, "She paid for my drawing class." The words came out flat, stripped of everything except the fact. "It seems so." "And the money for repairing the fireplace that year. The one Dad always said came from the church fund." Grace nodded. Claire lowered her head to another letter. Her fingers trembled slightly at the edges of the paper. Why did no one tell us? Maybe because no one knew. Or maybe because someone did know and found it easier to keep being angry than to admit the story they'd been telling was wrong. Theo picked up a photograph and brought it to Grace. Grandma is this mom when she was little. A girl of about 7 was wearing a blue coat and standing in the back garden of the guest house holding a basket of apples. The face was unmistakable, the same sharp chin, the same way of leaning forward into whatever came next. Grace looked at the picture and felt a piece of the puzzle slide into place. It must be from when your grandmother Ruth brought your mother here to visit. Claire looked up from the letter. I came here. Your grandmother must have brought you. I never knew about the visit, she never told me. Claire shook her head slowly, and Grace watched a memory surface in her daughter's face, the way a shape surfaces in water when the ripples settle. I remember a long trip. I was very small. There was a smell in the kitchen, cinnamon, I think, and a cat lying on the doorstep. The cat's name was June. Your grandmother told that story once years ago. I didn't realize she was talking about this place. Grace remembered the moment clearly now. Ruth at the kitchen table in Detroit, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, mentioning a cat and a child and cinnamon, in a voice that sounded like it was reaching back through time for something it could not quite hold. Grace had asked where, and Ruth had looked away and said, nowhere that matters anymore. And the conversation had ended the way all conversations about Dorothy ended in that house, with a silence that was not peaceful but walled. Claire looked around the room. I kept thinking you were holding on to a place that had nothing to do with us. But it turns out I'm the one who knew nothing. Grace sat down on the couch across from her. I didn't know either. I only found all this in the last 2 days. What are you going to do? The question filled the room slowly, evenly, all the way to the edge. Grace looked at the photographs on the wall at Dorothy and Ruth, by the lake at Claire, in her blue coat holding apples she did not remember picking. I'm not going to sell the whole property to Warren Keyes. Claire frowned. Are you sure the bills in Detroit aren't going to disappear? I know. Grace placed her hand on the lid of the wooden box. There are documents in here for a small savings fund, a few old bonds in Dorothy's name, and usage rights to the land behind the greenhouse. But I don't know how much the bonds are still worth. I need to meet with the lawyer to verify everything. Even if it all checks out, it's only enough to cover the back taxes and part of the debt, not all of it. So what about the rest? I can sell the empty northern parcel to the town council so they can open a public path to the riverbank. Keep the main house, the greenhouse, the back garden. That should cover the overdue taxes and most of what I owe. But I have to negotiate the price, and that takes time. Claire studied her mother's face. And this house, you're keeping it for what? So it doesn't become a parking lot for weekend visitors who will never know what stood here. So our family has a place to come back to when we need one. And so I don't have to pretend one more time that what was lost should just stay lost. Grace held her daughter's gaze. There are things that deserve to be kept even when keeping them is hard. Especially when keeping them is hard. Theo looked up from the floor where he had been arranging photographs in careful rows. Can we come here in the summer? Claire looked at her son, then at the photograph in his hand. She breathed out, and for the first time since arriving, the tension left her shoulders, not all at once, but in stages the way ice melts. Maybe. Grace stood and walked back into the hidden room. She sat at the piano bench, ran her hand across the lid, and noticed it sat slightly uneven one corner, raised a fraction higher than the others. She lifted it. Inside, beyond the hammers and strings, something white caught the light. An envelope sealed, tucked between 2 felt strips. She pulled it out carefully. The envelope was thick, the paper stiff with age. On the front, in Dorothy's handwriting, a single word, terms. Inside was a second will, handwritten on legal paper, signed by Dorothy Calloway, notarized by a public notary in Millbrook, New York. The will stated that if the heir chose to retain the property and remain in residence for a minimum of 1 year, a trust account at First National Bank would be activated containing sufficient funds to cover all outstanding property taxes and basic renovation costs. If the property was sold within the first year, the full amount would transfer to the Women's Charitable Foundation of Millbrook. Dorothy had planned for both outcomes. She had not forced anyone's hand. She had placed two doors side by side and let the person who found them choose. But the door that led to keeping the house required something money could not buy a year of Grace's life. A year away from Detroit, away from the hospital gift counter, away from the house where Robert's absence lived in every room. A year in a town where she knew almost no one in a house that needed more repair than she could afford, with nothing but Dorothy's silent faith that she would come. Grace carried the will to the tea table where Claire was still sitting. She placed it down without speaking. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. Not angry or impatient. The silence of someone doing arithmetic with something that cannot be measured in numbers. You would live here for a year. Claire's voice was careful, as if handling something fragile. I would try. What about the house in Detroit? Lock it up or rent it short term. I don't have all the answers, but I know enough to start. Grace's phone rang. Warren Keyes. She answered and pressed the speaker button. His voice filled the small room smooth and measured. Mrs. Thornton, I just wanted to ask whether you've had a chance to review the offer. I have. Excellent. If you'd like, I can bring the updated contract this afternoon. That won't be necessary. A pause, the kind that happens when the script jumps to an unrehearsed page. I won't be selling the entire property to you, Mr. Keyes. Warren's voice dropped the warmth, thinning the steel showing. You're passing up a very practical opportunity. I'm choosing a different one. With a property, this old sentiment doesn't cover maintenance costs. You're right, but I don't intend to pay with sentiment. Grace told him about the plan to sell the northern parcel and retain the main house. Then she added, each word placed with precision. And Mr. Keyes, I found the contract file. The one between you and Dorothy. The one she terminated when you filed a revised development plan that violated every condition you agreed to. And the note about you entering this house while she was at a doctor's appointment. The silence on the other end was absolute. I don't know what you wanted from this house besides the land. But if you'd like, I can show you the contract. Or you can leave me alone. Those are the options. Warren's voice, when it returned, had lost its polish. I understand. If you change your mind, you have my number. I don't think I will. The call ended. The silence that followed was clean the way air is clean after a storm passes. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived from Warren's attorney, asserting a boundary dispute over the northern parcel. The claim stated that the land Grace intended to sell overlapped with a plot Warren had acquired from a previous owner. Without resolution, no sale to the town council could proceed. Grace read the letter at the kitchen table. She did not panic. She had spent 3 years receiving letters that threatened consequences, and she had learned that the first step in dealing with a threat is to check whether it is real. She called June. June's voice came through with immediate certainty. Miss Dorothy kept the original cadastral map from 1952 in the bookcase in the living room, third shelf from the bottom behind the encyclopedias. She showed it to my mother once during a fence dispute with the neighbor on the west side. She said she kept every property document in the house because lawyers lose things and county clerks retire, but maps drawn on good paper last longer than either. Grace found the map exactly where June described. It was rolled in a cardboard tube, the paper thick and slightly yellowed, but the lines still sharp, drawn with the meticulous precision of a surveyor, who understood that accuracy on paper prevents conflict on the ground. The northern parcel's boundaries were marked clearly, and they did not overlap with anything Warren or anyone else could claim. She sent a copy to Naomi, who confirmed within a day that the map was legally valid, and Warren's claim had no foundation. Naomi filed a response. Warren's attorney did not reply. Warren Keyes did not call again. He did not send flowers. He did not drive up the gravel road. He simply disappeared from the story the way people disappear when they realize the thing they were trying to take is held by someone who knows exactly what it is worth. Claire stayed 2 extra days. She did not announce this as a decision. She simply did not leave on Monday morning as planned. And when Grace noticed, Claire shrugged and said she had made a few calls and the office could manage without her until Wednesday. They worked, not with any grand plan, but with the practical, unhurried rhythm of two people who have decided that a place is worth saving and are figuring out how. Mornings, Claire sat on the front porch with her laptop handling work calls, her voice carrying through the open windows into the house where Grace was on her knees, scrubbing the kitchen floor or testing the water pressure upstairs. Afternoons they worked together, measuring the porch roof for repair estimates, testing which windows still opened and which had swollen shut, checking the kitchen pipes with a wrench June had lent them. Theo painted the window boxes along the back of the house with a seriousness that bordered on reverence, choosing a shade of blue from old paint cans found in the greenhouse, the same blue as the coat in the photograph of his mother as a little girl. When Grace asked him why that color, he looked at her with the uncomplicated honesty of a child who does not yet know that some answers carry more weight than the question deserves. Because it's the color Mom was wearing when she was happy and didn't know it yet. In the evenings, the three of them sat in the hidden room. Claire read through the remaining letters while Theo arranged photographs in rows on the rug, building a timeline from images he could not fully understand, but seemed to recognize on some level deeper than knowledge. Grace brought the muffins from the kitchen on the small plates June had included, and they ate in the quiet, companionable way that people eat when the food is secondary to the being together. On the second evening, June stopped by with a casserole dish and a bottle of apple cider. She stood in the doorway of the hidden room for a long moment, looking at the photographs on the wall. And Grace watched the woman's face change the careful composure, softening into something unguarded and raw. June reached up and touched the edge of a photograph showing a small girl sitting on porch steps with a book open on her lap. "That's me," she said quietly. "I must have been 8. I didn't know she kept this." She stood there for another moment, her fingertips resting on the edge of the photograph, and then she took a breath and smiled in the way people smile when they are trying to hold something inside that wants very much to come out. She kept more than any of us knew. I think that was her way. Keeping things instead of saying them, as if the keeping was the saying. After June left, Claire opened a letter that was shorter than the others. It contained only 2 questions written in the center of the page, the handwriting slightly less steady, as if the hand that wrote them had begun to feel the weight of the years it carried. Does your back still ache when the weather turns cold? And does Claire still like apple pie? Claire placed the letter on her knee. She did not speak. Her eyes reddened and she pressed her lips together. And Grace watched her daughter sit with the weight of being known by someone she had never met, loved by someone she had been taught to forget. And she understood that this was the moment when anger gives way to grief, and grief gives way to something that is not quite forgiveness but is close enough to begin. On Wednesday morning, Claire packed her bag. Theo carried the painted window box to the back garden and set it beneath the kitchen window, stepping back to admire it with the critical eye of an artist who knows his work is not perfect, but is proud of it anyway. Claire stood by her car keys in hand. She looked at the house one more time, and Grace saw her daughter's eyes move from the porch to the windows to the roofline. Not with the appraising gaze she had arrived with, but with something softer. The gaze of someone committing a place to memory because she has realized she will need to carry it with her. "I can come back at the end of the month if you still need help." "I will." "Don't do everything alone." "I won't." Claire opened the car door, then paused. She turned back and looked at her mother, and her face held an expression Grace had never seen before, the expression of a woman standing at the edge of a grief that is also somehow a gift. The letter, the one with the two questions. She knew about my back. She knew I liked apple pie. She knew things about me that some of my friends don't know. Claire's voice caught on something it could not quite get past. How do you mourn someone you never met but who never stopped watching over you? Grace did not answer because some questions are not meant to be answered, but to be carried. And carrying them is how you honor the person who left them for you. She stepped forward and put her arms around her daughter, and Claire leaned into her the way she used to lean when she was very small, with her full weight without holding anything back. They stood like that on the gravel drive for a long moment, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing left to say that the holding did not already say better. The car pulled away. Theo waved from the back seat until the trees swallowed the road. Grace stood on the porch and watched them go, and the silence that returned was not the silence of absence, but the silence of a house that has heard what it needed to hear and is settling back into itself, patient and unhurried, willing to wait. That afternoon, Grace sat alone in the hidden room. The pale light fell across the tea table, across the open wooden box, across the letters and photographs Dorothy had spent a lifetime collecting. She picked up the will from the piano and read it one more time. 1 year, 12 months in a town she did not know, in a house that needed more repair than she could calculate, with a trust fund that would only open if she stayed. She thought about the hospital gift counter, about the flickering porch light in Detroit, about Robert, who would have loved this place, who would have walked through every room with his hands in his pockets and his head tilted back looking at the ceiling beams, with the quiet appreciation of a man who understood that the things worth having are usually the things that take the most work. She thought about Claire reading the letters with trembling hands, about Theo painting the window box blue, about June standing in the doorway touching a photograph of herself at 8 and realizing she had been kept too without knowing it. She thought about Dorothy, who had written letters she never sent, paid bills she never signed, kept photographs of a family that did not know she was watching, and built a room with no windows to hold the things she could not say out loud. Because some people love in whispers, and the only way to hear them is to stand very close and be very still. Grace stood up. She walked to the piano and pressed a single key. The note rang out slightly flat from years of disuse, but clear, traveling through the hidden room and out through the gap in the panel and down the hallway and into the house which received it. The way old houses receive sound, absorbing it into the wood, into the plaster, into the grain of the floors that had held the weight of everyone who had ever walked across them. She closed the piano lid. She walked into the kitchen, where the late afternoon light was coming through the windows at the angle that turns everything it touches into gold. She filled the kettle. She set it on the stove. She stood at the counter and looked out at the back garden, where the wild roses caught the light, and the greenhouse stood with its cracked panes, and the brick path wound toward the tree line, and beyond the trees somewhere she could not see the river move toward the sea. The way time moves in one direction without stopping, carrying everything with it that is not held down by love or memory or the stubborn refusal to let go. The kettle whistled. Grace poured the water and carried the cup to the front porch. She sat down in the chair that must have been Dorothy's, the one with armrests worn smooth by years of the same hands resting in the same position, and she looked out at the road that led away from the house and toward the town, and beyond the town toward Detroit, and beyond Detroit toward every place she had ever been and every place she might still go. The sun was going down. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the grass. Somewhere in the branches, a bird was singing a song that had no words and needed none. Grace took a sip of her tea. It was still too hot, but she held the cup anyway, feeling the warmth spread through her palms and into her wrists and up her arms and into the center of her chest, where something that had been cold for a very long time was beginning slowly to thaw. She would call Naomi in the morning. She would begin the paperwork for the northern parcel. She would make a list of repairs, starting with the porch roof. and ending with the greenhouse, and she would work through them. The way Dorothy had worked through her lists, one task at a time, one day at a time with the patient. Unsentimental devotion of a woman who understood that keeping a house is not so different from keeping a promise. The light faded. The first stars appeared faint and tentative, as if they were not sure they were welcome. Grace stayed on the porch. The cup grew cool in her hands. The house stood behind her, solid and imperfect, full of rooms she had not yet opened, and stories she had not yet read, and a hidden chamber where a woman who never learned how to say "I love you" had spent a lifetime saying it in every other way she could find. If Dorothy could have seen this moment. The porch, the cooling tea, the woman sitting in her chair, looking out at the same trees she had watched for 50 years. She might have folded her hands in her lap and nodded once the way she did when something turned out the way she had hoped, but had not dared to expect. She might have reached for her pen and written one last note in the margins of her notebook, between a reminder to order Earl Grey and a note to check the pipes before the first frost. She stayed. And that would have been enough.